Hello there, Banditos. I hope you missed us because we certainly missed you guys after our little week-long respite. So we had to recharge a bit, but we're back in full force. But have no fear, it's that time of week again. Depending on where you live, it might be Hump Day, it may be Comic Book Day, or just Wednesday. But around here, we call it Dollar Bin Bandit Day. And we have a brand new show in store for you today on this August 10th. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And before we get to that, we have to announce that today is our 100th episode. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this for 100 episodes in the can. It's pretty amazing. All the way back to our very first, YouTube episode. Then we started moving into the Apple Podcasts and all that fun stuff. 100. And here's to 100 more. And to kick off the next 100, well, we're bringing you our interview with none other than Bob Greenberger. Bob has worked for both DC and Marvel and on titles such as Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC Comics Presents, and Brave and the Bold. He's also worked on a bunch of novelizations for Star Trek Next Generation, Hellboy 2, and Predator. He's done a lot of great work.
Yeah, I'm not a Star Trek guy, but I respect Star Trek a lot. And the fact that his Star Trek writing has connected with the fans around the world so much, because in this day and age, so many people get so nitpicky about Star Trek or Star Wars, the things that they hold dear to their heart. But his writing is connected so well with them. And he's really made some incredible stories.
I was lucky enough to work with Bob Greenberger during my short-lived stint at Marvel. His was short-lived as well, unfortunately. But, what I took away from that experience is his overall drive to make collected editions better and to make any comic that he's editing better. But particularly, he found a niche with collected editions, really taking what DC and Marvel had as, these single issues and subscriptions and turning them into, what we have today, which are these collections of stories and making, a name for that format. So let's hear more from Bob Greenberger.
Doing okay. How about you guys?
Doing very well, thank you. Like I said, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to us.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to ask you the same first question we ask everyone, and that is, how did you discover comics?
I was asthmatic as a child, and usually every fall, as the leaves fell and the air got kicked up, I wound up with a bad case of bronchitis. And when I was 6 years old, I was in bed, not really able to do much. And Mom brought me a Superman comic to entertain me. And that was it. Light switch. Everything changed.
Do you still have that comic?
I got, there was something about that 4-color adventure and something about Superman's daring do. I wish I could remember what comic it was. I was a little sick, but from there I discovered the George Reeves reruns on local television in New York City. So, wow, I could see this guy fly and, burst through walls. And this was fascinating. And before you knew it, I was buying comics or having comics bought for me with incredible regularity.
Do you still have any of those comics that you originally collected?
Sadly, no. No, long time ago, I divested myself of the collection. Sad story involved in that. But it was all DC all the time. And it was the Mort Weisinger books. But I really found myself gravitating to the Julie Schwartz edited titles. So it's Justice League and Batman Detective, The Atom, Green Lantern and all. And as a result, I was blindsided when the Marvel Superheroes cartoons ran in syndication, 1966, 67. I had no idea who these characters were. But all the kids in elementary school knew I was a big comic fan. I said, who are these guys? Because they didn't know who, Thor and the Submariner was and all. And I had no idea, but I was watching and I was fascinated. And then one day I came home from school and on the kitchen table was Thor number 134. Mom had seen it at the card shop and said, he's been watching that. I recognize this guy and got it for me. It was like, there was the introduction of the High Evolutionary and had a cameo from Quicksilver and Wanda. And it was like, whoa, what is all this? So really it was the next door opening for me.
That's fantastic. Let me ask you a quick question. And this is my only off the rails because I know we have our list of questions here, but you said you were all DC. And I know a
Yeah.
lot of people tend to gravitate, you know, right. I mean, at any time, people read everything and anything. But I'm always curious. DC versus Marvel. Why did you tend to read DC? Obviously, I do the same because you could see all my stuff. But
Well, obviously, the first always has a deep emotional impression. It's like, it's your favorite brand of pizza or ice cream. It's that shop, it's that brand that has imprinted itself on you.
Right.
So for the first 2-3 years of life, knowing only the DC universe stuff, it had time to seep into the pores. But once I discovered Marvel, I recognized it's a whole other type of storytelling and a whole other art style. And I will admit that there was a period where the Marvel zombie had kicked in. And I remember going to the farmer's market in Nassau County and more or less trading in every DC I had for back issues of the Avengers.
Wow.
And then I realized, no, the DC stuff was really good. I had to go back and buy them all over again.
The indiscretions of youth.
Exactly.
So,
but had I started on Spider-Man, I'd be the same thing, just in reverse.
Right. Fair enough.
So you actually kind of broke into the industry through a fanzine, right? The comic scene?
Okay. I broke into the industry more because of an incredible series of connections I made through the conventions of the 1970s. You have to understand, I'll paint you a picture, that the Phil Seuling New York Comic Book Convention every July 4th weekend at the Statler Hilton Hotel in Manhattan was the thing. It was before San Diego really took off and all. And Phil, for a couple of years, also had what he called Second Sunday, which was the second Sunday of the month, which was basically just the dealer's room part of the convention. But it meant we'd go into the city and we'd go to the Statler and we'd wander, or, the dealer's room. But that's where that second generation of creators, Bernie Wrightson, Len Wein, Jerry Conway, Steve Gerber, all these guys, they were buying comics too. And they were just hanging out in the hall, and you get to talk to these guys. And there's Paul Levitz and Paul Kupperberg and Carl Gafford and Tony Isabel sitting there selling fanzines. And you become friends. You make these connections. They're doing fanzines. I ask how do you make fanzines? Adam Malin and Gary Berman were doing their Infinity prozine of sorts, and they were the slicker version. And I spent a fascinating Sunday at Adam Malin's house, learning how he and Gary did Infinity, and he explained to me and my best friend Jeff at the time what he was doing, and then showed me the floor plan at a different hotel in Manhattan for the very first creation convention where I wound up as a gopher. So it's all these connections with the 1970s, knowing all these people who wound up getting careers in the business. And those connections helped out tremendously, so that Paul Levitz had become a good friend, and then he went on staff at DC. And we stayed in touch while I was at college. And when I was graduating in 1980, my job at Starlog Press wasn't ready until September, and I needed summer work because then I had to pay rent. Paul hired me as summer help. And I sat in the library reading all the DC books I could to create what was going to be their company's first property catalog that their international department could then sell to foreign publishers. And there was nothing like it before. It was always very, I guess, organic in how that worked. And while I was there, I was housed in a half office, very tiny space, with Andy Helfer, who had been hired to do work with Jeanette on Wonder Woman's 40th anniversary. But the company was growing, and Joe Orlando's special projects department was, in need of extra hands. So Andy and I got pulled off the jobs we were hired for to start working on special project stuff. And Andy made enough of an impression that he was kept on full time. I went to Starlog, where I started covering the comics business. But while I was at DC for the summer of 1980, I made all these connections so that when I created Comic Scene for Starlog Press, which was not so much a fanzine, but the first nationally distributed newsstand magazine about comic books, which is a step above a fanzine.
Sure.
I was able to parlay all those connections to get interviews, get artwork, get news, information. So it was like Jim Shooter took me to lunch one day with Jim Starlin because he wanted Comic Scene to break the story about their Epic creator-owned deal. So it was things like that. The magazine lasted 11 bi-monthly issues, and when it was canceled, it was just in time for me to go to San Diego and effectively beg Dick Giordano for a job, which happened 6 months later, and I joined DC in January 1984.
Now, one of your first jobs there was assistant editor, correct?
Right. I was Plan B.
Okay.
Plan A was to hire Denny O'Neil for Marvel because he and Shooter were not seeing eye to eye. But Denny had some health issues and didn't want to jeopardize his insurance at the time and said no. So Len and Marv needed help for the Crisis in the Who's Who. So Dick said, well, I got the salary line. I'll use it, to hire Bob. And I joined and worked with Len and Marv, doing research on the Who's Who and helping write that stuff, and then helping Marv and George figure out the Crisis.
I was say, what are the responsibilities of an assistant editor?
Generally, the assistant editor is the trafficker. He gets the schedules from editorial administration. It is his job to make sure that all the work is flowing, that the editor looks at scripts in the right order, because if an editor has multiple books, which is the one where, if you don't read this tomorrow, the guy's got nothing to draw, as opposed to the script that's a week early, things like that. The assistant editor makes sure copies are made and then sent out to the talent, make sure stuff is trafficked between marketing and editorial, things like the solicitations or ad copy. Liaises with the production department to make sure the stuff the book is handed over to be proofread and then corrections. It's usually the assistant editor who gets first look at corrected pages. And then, you're training at the editor's feet so that you're sitting in on plot conferences and you're hearing conversations between the editor and the colorist to understand, why things are working or not working. So it's an amazing training ground.
You mentioned Who's Who.
There it is.
Dude, Oren knows, I've been trying to get as many of the single issues as I can. And then they announced that they put this sucker out. And let me tell you, it's the best reading. Aside from any single issue that's out there, so much fun to read.
While a lot of the information is dated, the art is still eternal.
It's great though. My son, who's 6 and just learning about characters, he just thumbs through it and he's asking about these characters and that character. Sure. Mind you, there are characters that have no longer been in the comics for ages. And I'm like, he's like Captain Nazi. I'm like, you know what? Let's do a different character. It's a lot of baggage on that one. However, you did mention working on Crisis as kind of one of your first major, gigs as a part of that role. What was that like working on that of all tasks?
They wanted the Monitor. They knew they were going to use him. He was going to be this pivotal character putting the wheels in motion, but they hadn't figured out what the motion was. They knew that they needed to reorder the universe. They needed to collapse the multiverse into a single universe. That was the whole impetus behind it. Because Jeanette Kahn, as the publisher at the time, felt that the continuity was a little off-putting to people who may not have grown up on the material. So every week we would have lunch brought in, and Len, Marv, and I would sit in the conference room and we just hash out all these crazy ideas. Julie Schwartz always kept a series of science books in his office. By the time we got there, they were dated because he had stopped editing, his line of books effectively. Was down to just Superman. But he still had the books and let us have that. And we said, the atom was split for the first time in 1938. And Superman debuted in 1938. Is there something here we can work with? We were looking for anything at the time. And we finally started to piece it together as spring 84 was rolling along. And then we had an editorial retreat where we had enough of the material beat out, and George was on board at this point as the artist and started to come to some of our plotting conferences. And we had an editorial retreat off-site up in Mohawk and up, is that Westchester? Or?
Well, that's across the river, I think, like Orange.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the Mohawk Retreat House.
Mm-hmm.
And there, Dick told every editor, this is what's happening. Here's how your books are going to tie in. Starting with every book will have 2 appearances of the Monitor in advance of the crisis #1. And Marv and Len outlined what that meant. It could be passive, it could be interactive, he could be a villain or a hero, depending upon what your needs are. We wanted to create a sense of mystery about him before we introduced him in crisis #1. Most every editor, from the most senior veteran guys like Murray Boltonoff, who was just hanging on with his one war book, you know, to the younger editors like Alan Gold and Janice Race, young in terms of their tenure at the company, were all on board. Only one editor basically crossed his arms and said, not in my book, you're putting him. And when Dick said, yes, you are, refused to talk to the rest of us for the rest of the trip, including the ride back home to New York.
At least he was handling it like a mature adult.
Yeah.
Since we're discussing Crisis, I really have to ask. First of all, so do you still keep up with comics and kind of follow what's okay? Good.
I do for a number of reasons. One, I'm still a fan. 2, I still do some consulting with DC's international department, so I have to be current on the material.
Okay, good. So that being said, all right. Well, if you're still consulting, I'll be good. What's your take on the kind of the reoccurring crises that keep happening?
It's going to the well one time too often. About 10 times ago.
Okay.
They've lost sight of the impact of these events, and I think they've totally lost sight of its impact on the common man. It's always the heroes and it's the villains. There is so much about the personal lives of the characters that have been ignored for about a decade now.
Yeah.
Pretty much since the New 52. Batman currently, as a great example, somehow through the stupidest plot device I can think of in the last couple of years, loses all his money. Well, we've seen such a little impact on what it means to be Bruce Wayne, living within his means all of a sudden. I couldn't even tell you where he's living today because it is such a tertiary aspect of what Batman's about now. So it's about crisis after crisis, event after event,
right.
With more and more characters thrown into Gotham City, and we've lost sight of the character of the guys on the street in Gotham. I mean, and we've lost sight of Bruce Wayne, and I think it's a crime.
I agree with you. As much as I love DC, and I really do, I just feel that every event is just another build up to the next event. So we just had
there's
one.
No breathing room. There's no breathing room
Yeah.
in between events, and there's no real exploration of the new status quo before the next status quo.
Right.
And I think there's some storytelling opportunities that are totally missed.
Yeah, I remember the day when you just had a good story arc for a particular character. No event. It's just this is what's happening, and we're going to really we're going to challenge the character in his own comic.
Well, I think Tom Taylor's doing that in Nightwing. I think Tom Taylor's doing a superb job there. Where Dick Grayson wants to use his money effectively, and it's basically Dick Grayson versus Blockbuster. I think he's doing some terrific stuff there.
Cool. Thank you for answering that. I was just curious because I know, some people may be a little reserved in answering that, especially if they're doing work with DC, but I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
I think you make an interesting point, though, about Batman particularly, because he, the essence of his character is much more of a solitary figure. I mean, sometimes with Robin, and they've surrounded him with such a family and such a team, not to mention the Justice League and all of these crises where he's operating with so many other characters that the essence of who he is somehow gets lost.
And
in a lot of ways, he is a modern day version of the 1960s Batman who was, out in broad daylight hanging out with the cops and all.
Yeah.
They always say that, or he always gives that line. Oh, I work alone. I don't work with the team. But then you turn around. Hey, right, guys? I only work with no teams. And he's got a whole bat family behind him of people.
Once they started using Oracle as the woman in the chair for Batman, and then it became Penny One, and then it was Lucius Fox. It was just like, what happened to doing it yourself?
Yeah.
True.
Another project that you worked on early on was the adaptation of the Star Trek movie. When that came out, does the studio tell you what they're looking for specifically in the comic book, or is it up to you guys to pare down the movie to fit into a comic?
Most movie adaptations, the company buys the rights to the adaptation, and then editorial and marketing figure out what's the right package size, 48 page, 64, hot and bigger, whatever. And back then you could have the comic come out the same time as the movie, possibly even a couple of days in advance. I think Return of the Jedi sort of put the kibosh on that, and then Close Encounters and all. So Paramount knew we were going to do the adaptation, and actually I was able to go to their offices in Manhattan. And again, here's where connections help. Because of my work at Starlog Press, I was working with their publicist, a guy named Tom Phillips, who knew me from Starlog and therefore trusted me to sit down with all the photo albums filled with slides from the movie that I could pick, knowing what I needed for my artist. They would have duplicates made for me. And then I had to buy a device that back then, today it sounds quaint, but I would be able to put the slide in a viewer, press a button, and get a Polaroid. And I would have to make like 2 Polaroids of every slide, one for the penciler, one for the inker, keep the slides to show the colorist, for specific things. And then, so there I am in the conference room. I had to close the door for Star Trek 3 because no one needed to know Spock's coming back. And, I'm laying out all the Polaroids to dry, and, door opens, go away. And then I had to carefully package up the photography to send off to both Tom Sutton and Ricardo Villagrán. But Paramount knew it was a 64-page book. They knew we were given carte blanche, with the access to the material. We had the script months in advance. That wasn't going to be a problem. Mike Barr was trusted by Paramount by that point with what he had done with the book on a monthly basis to do the Star Trek 3 and later Star Trek 4 adaptations, without blinking an eye.
Was there some hope that getting Star Trek would be sort of a touchstone moment, like for Marvel when they got Star Wars, to start their own franchise with it?
Marv lobbied DC in 1982 after seeing Wrath of Khan to get the license. He felt that the way the license was structured when Marvel had it a couple of years earlier hamstrung them, because they were limited to only what was in the motion picture, not the 79 episodes that preceded it. DC's license gave them everything that had been filmed, and that gave him a lot more room to explore. I think Marv was doing it because he saw the potential in Star Trek as a comic book. He had grown up on the TV show. His buddy Len Wein had been writing for the Gold Key version back in the 70s. And it was like, let's do it, and let's do it right this time. And that's what happened.
You were editing, the Star Trek book. You had the adaptations, and then you parlayed that into, being part of the novels that were coming out as well. Does that mean that you had a pre-existing Star Trek fandom, or did this all start when this was kind of assigned to you and became part of DC?
Oh no, I grew up on Star Trek. I have the vaguest of memories of being maybe 9 years old, seeing my father watching this show, and it wasn't until later I could piece together these people who twinkled out of sight, that what it was. I really came to understand it with the WPIX reruns right after the show went into syndication. But was enough of a fan quickly. I attended the first convention and then was a volunteer at the next 4 annual original committee conventions in New York City. So I was deeply a part of Star Trek fandom, active at the conventions and all. So when I got to do the comic, and this is where the comic book guy in me said, well, there were novels and there were comics and they shouldn't contradict one another. So I called up the editors of Pocketbooks and got to know them. And we started to not so much coordinate, but share information. You know, when's the next time you're using Klingons? When's the next time I'm going to, want to use, the Gorn or something? And that led to my maintaining a stardate chart for the novels and the comics, which I ran in the letter columns every now and then to show how everything coordinated. And the original editor had left Pocket and was replaced by a guy named Dave Stern. Dave had so many New York area authors working for him at the time. He started hosting every couple of month cocktail parties and invited me along to meet the authors and for Dave and I to get to know each other beyond the occasional phone call. At that point, the Robert Lynn Aspirin Thieves World shared universe novels were a thing. And at one of the cocktail parties, people were saying, what about, do you see Star Trek doing something similar to Thieves World? Which led to a couple of the writers all chiming in going, yeah, we could do something like that. At which point I, had enough story knowledge in me. I was like, can I try? And they figured, all right, well, if he's writing with all these other people, if he sucks, they'll cover it up. So I got to work on Doomsday World with Michael Chan Friedman, Peter David, and Carmen Carter. And that worked out so well that after Carmen decided she was done writing Star Trek, Peter, Mike, and I went on to write other collaborations, which is where we got to become hopefully a force for good, because that parlayed into my hiring Mike and Peter to work on the Star Trek comics. Then the three of us went to work on the After Earth material for Will Smith 10 years ago and things like that.
I find it fascinating. The whole thing is fascinating, but particularly the coordination that you sought between the books and the comics, because that sounds like an early, predecessor to the sort of shared media world that we have now, especially with the MCU.
Mm-hmm. Mike, back then, you have to remember when initially Lucasfilm was treating the comics from Marvel and the comic strip at the LA Syndicate as part of their canon, along with pretty much every novel after Splinter in a Mind's Eye, where they really didn't know what they were doing at the time. And, remember, Admiral Akbar was introduced in the comic strip before the movies and so on. And when I came on board and was helping Marv on the Star Trek comic, I was getting into fights with the Paramount licensing people over, some of their misunderstanding of the canon. I was correcting them and getting into arguments where our managing editor, Terry Cunningham, kept saying, calm down. It's only a start date. So when I had the chance to coordinate, yes, I wanted to, at the time, imitate what Lucas was doing because I thought Star Trek deserved it. So I want to give credit more to Lucasfilm for what we now have as the, not quite the metaverse, but the shared media.
And the assumption in both cases is that the property is more powerful than the medium. So people are going to go to whatever form that story is being told in and, want to see probably coordination because they're buying all of these different media.
Yeah. Now, when we got the V license, again, Marv lobbied for that because we both liked the miniseries and he thought that would make for an interesting show. Comic book, I meant because the show was going to be a weekly on NBC. I reached out to the people, I think it was Pinnacle who had the license for the novels, never got a call back. So, there was an opportunity to coordinate that just went right over heads.
I was going to ask you a follow-up question about Star Trek, but you just mentioned V. So I'm going to ask you about V because that was one of my favorite series as a child. And I am currently, no joke, rewatching it right now.
Okay, cool.
Because it is, I'm looking at it through just a new lens. One, I'm looking at it and I'm like, wow, there's really a lot of interesting social commentary in this. Also, there are plot holes that you can drive a truck through. But at the same time, it's so much fun.
Now, when you're rewatching, you talk about the 2 miniseries or the weekly as well?
No, the mini series, because
Okay.
I think that the actual the TV series version of it just I mean, and I'll watch it, but there's something a little bit more I find it a little bit more scary, if you will, or
Well, that's Ken
compared
Johnson.
to the,
Ken Johnson was a TV veteran who really knew how to do, the genre stuff. You're talking about the guy who gave us the Incredible Hulk and made it an effective TV show. He really had something to say about the visitors and about manipulation and all. The World War II parallels were intentional. And that's what, all of our attention at DC.
Yeah, it was it was, I remember as a child watching it with my dad on TV, he's watching it and I'm sitting next to him, and I remember like getting a little scared, and then now I'm watching it, I'm like, why was I scared of this? Like there's the initial scene where Diana swallows the
rodent,
a hamster or something like that. There's like this cut scene where it's her about to put it in her mouth, cuts away, cuts back. It's clearly a dummy. It doesn't even have any resemblance to Diana. Then you cut back and it's her with like a prosthetic around her neck. I'm like, guys, come on. But then I'm like, Independence Day really ripped off from V. Holy cow. But you said that you had acquired the license to do that as a book.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and forgive me for not knowing this, but was that actually created into a comic or a book at that time?
It ran Marv convinced DC to pick up the license because Star Trek was selling for us. We got 18 issues out of it.
Wow, that's awesome.
Written by Carrie Bates, drawn mostly by Carmen Infantino and Tony DeZuniga.
Wow, that's amazing.
Covers by Jerry Bingham. They were actually, the covers were terrific.
And this needs to be a part of my life. Now it was, in line with what we were discussing, were you able to expand upon what was already on the series? Maybe giving backstory to certain characters.
We were going to be launching after the weekly show had started, so we were getting scripts, and there was only so much they had figured out in advance. Today, a whole season would have been plotted out. Right. It was more like in batches of episodes. They had some idea where their endpoint was going to be. But the producers hadn't done science fiction before and clearly had no respect for science fiction. So they're making shit up as they went along. The whole thing with Star Child and nonsense, the powers and just some crazy nonsense was going on. At the Anaheim World Science Fiction Convention, in, I guess it was 1984, the producers had done a presentation at the convention. And by that point, we'd already picked up the license. So I was there to hear what the producers had to say. And I was sitting with a journalist from the LA Herald Examiner who was covering it as well. And we had struck up a conversation and, getting along, sitting there listening. By the end of it, our jaws dropped and said, these guys have no idea what science fiction is or how to keep the science in the fiction. Mm-hmm. And we both said, it's going to be a disaster. Show's not going to work. That guy stopped writing newspapers and went into writing movies and television. And you may know him as J. Michael Straczynski.
That guy.
I've heard that name somewhere.
Yeah, he may be something someday.
I have a question about your style as an editor, because I know as an editor, you want to encourage the folks working with you to do the best they can. But there's times you're going to have maybe some tough conversations with either, a veteran artist or a writer or a younger person. How did you approach the job?
Coming in 1984, it was great because you still had Julie Schwartz and Murray Boltinoff, the real veterans there. And they were more than welcoming to have you drop in and chat with them. And you had Len and Marv, who had been editing for comics for over 10 years each. You had other people at the beginning of their career, like Greenberger and Alan Gold, Janice Race and all. So it was a real mix of experiences and backgrounds and all. But overseeing all of it was Dick Giordano. And I saw how Dick talked to talent. I saw how Dick spoke to the veterans as well as the guys walking in the door for the first time. And it was Dick who taught me how to critique art, considering I had no art training. I was a story guy. And when we take talent out to meals, I watched how Dick, handled the conversations. I'm at a convention, I see how Len and Marv deal with the fans at the table, or, in a casual conversation, away from the table and all. They were role models all. And then I was developing my own style. In a lot of ways, Len was very much a seat of your pants plotter. And therefore that applied to his editing as well. So when he was doing Batman with Doug Manch, Doug pretty much drove the train, and Len just said, well, instead of going north, can you go northeast? Because I think the story would arc better this way. And Doug would go, yeah, that makes sense. They had a dialogue and it went that way. When I started to get books of my own to edit, and I started generating my own books, I would be able to pick the creative team. And for me, I was the coach. I put the team together, and I wanted the team, the writer and the penciler and the inker, to really talk to one another and all be of a mind and hear each other about what they expected of the book. And once we had a firm foundation of what we wanted this book to be, I pretty much let them fly. But with the writer, I always wanted the next 6 to 8 months figured out where we were going. One, to make sure we set everything up so that it read properly. Two, I had information for solicitation, because the solicitation cycle precedes, when the books were coming out. And three, if something happened and I needed a fill-in, we could figure out where in the, the artist is running late. I need someone else to draw the next issue. I know where we're going, So to me, having a framework for 6 to 8 months out always made me comfortable. And my guys didn't give me a lot of pushback, although for a lot of them, it was a little different.
Makes sense.
In that first stint at DC, I'm curious what your favorite books were to edit, and then maybe some also unsung heroes, things that you thought didn't get the credit they deserved.
Oh, good question. Obviously, being the fanboy I was, being able to edit Star Trek for 8 years was like, oh my God, I'm editing Star Trek. This was just, amazing time. And to this day, people look back at the run that Marv started with Mike Barr and then I picked up on. They think of it very fondly. It has stood the test of time, and people continue to look back and go, yeah, that was great stuff. So that's very heartening for me. Obviously, Suicide Squad. Starting that from scratch with John Ostrander and Luke McDonnell is definitely one of the highest points. Unsung heroes. I was called into Denny O'Neill's office one day, and Denny says, "You're getting Warlord. I'm done with it." I was like, "Huh?" And he was like, "Yeah, I don't have any feel for this book. You hang on to it." And Dick said to me, "Look, the book's going to be canceled. The sales are declining. Just run out the string, have some fun." Well, I get the book with issue 109. And Michael Fleischer was on a long-term contract with DC and was going to stay on as the writer. But I was losing my artists, and I was able to get Jen Dursema and Tom Mandrake, who at the time were, just coming out of the Kubert School, just getting their feet wet. Jen had just done Ariane for DC. Tom had done some Batman stuff, but they were married and liked working together. And I asked them if they would step in and do Warlord. And they said, okay. And I took Michael to lunch with Tom and Jan. Now, Michael may have had lunch with the editors before. He was particularly close with Andy Helfer, but I don't think he ever really sat with the artists before. And as the artists were coming in, and that energized him so much hearing their ideas, and he was feeding off them, and he was saying, well, what about this? And they were saying, oh yeah, I could do this. So it was a great back and forth, and it was such an energizing launch that it really, by bringing them into draw it and Michael getting energized, it gave the book a new lease on life. I got to issue 133 before it was canceled. So, to me, that is, I did my job as an editor. I was told, run with it. They figured it would be gone by 110, 115. I got to 133. So to me, that's a success. I did my job. It was a good commercial, solid book.
Kudos.
Yeah, definitely. While at DC, you worked on a series called Time Masters.
Yes.
And I love that series. I love the characters involved. Now, do you get to choose those characters, or really any set of characters that you wanted to work on?
In the wake of the crisis, Paul Levitz held a series of editorial meetings in his role as at the time he was just becoming publisher. Jeanette was moving to president and editor-in-chief. And Paul said, the crisis, one universe. What are the new rules? And we had to talk about the rules of magic, and the rules of time travel, and the rules of this and that. And, we were all feeling our way through it. And there was some editors were like, I've already been told what to do. I'm done with that. Nobody really thought about the repercussions. And to me, that's the one thing that Dick Giordano, Marv, and I all really didn't focus enough on, what the reality was going to be afterwards, and how the rules were going to work. So Paul drove those things, and everyone agreed that we should limit how time travel was, so stop being a Deus Ex Machina storyline. And as we started to develop what those rules were going to be, Bob Wayne, who was in the marketing department at the time, had a buddy named Louis Shiner, who was a software engineer and writer. The two of them had done some work for the George R.R. Martin Wild Cards anthology series. And they came to me and they said, we're really fascinated by the new rules of time travel. Can we do something with Rip Hunter? And I said, this is a great way to show the readers what the new rules were. And so we developed, they developed the pitch, and I took it to Dick and Paul, and they gave it a green light. I picked R.T. Bear to pencil it because he was coming out of our new talent showcase program, and he had the promise of being a really interesting penciler. But he proved to be so slow at it that the book took forever to get drawn and come out. And Art proved himself an incredibly talented inker, and that's where he made his bread and butter until the last couple of years when he did penciling and inking. But back then he was at the beginning, so had Jose Marzan come in to ink that, and that's where in their pitch they figured out which errors and which other DC characters they wanted to deal with. It was their idea to do the Illuminati with Vandal Savage behind it all, and everyone said, sure, have fun.
That's awesome. I love those characters because, first of all, they're not always around. And when they do pop in, it's going to be something good. And sure. Most recently, like whenever they appear, they kind of leave these breadcrumbs as to what may happen down the line. Yes. Kind of like what they've done with Rip Hunter's Blackboard, like they're all the just the writings and notes and things like that. They're fantastic. They're a real fantastic set of characters, and I know that they were able to really wrap them into the continuity as it pertains to like Booster Gold, and sure. Based upon that, so they're just really, really great characters. Now, do you have? You described your amazing team, but are you able as an editor to tell them, like, I want to do this with that character, I want to do that? Can you impart, kind of a direction as to where you want these characters to ultimately go, end up, or do?
That is a little more heavy-handed than I was accustomed to in that day. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, George Cashton and Murray Boltinoff and Jack Schiff, and these guys, they were in control. They pretty much said, we're doing this, and It really wasn't until the 70s when things started to change and the writers and the artists had more say over the storylines, which then shifted, what the next generation of editors were going to be like. So the only time I had to be heavy-handed was when there was a crossover and we had a particular beat that had to be hit, and it felt to my book to hit that beat, whatever. That's the only time I said, we're crossing over with, my Suicide Squad is going to cross over with Detective and Swamp Thing and Captain Atom this month from Millennium. And I got Jerry Bingham to do a cover that ties it all together. I need something in the story, and I basically fed that to John Ostrander, who said, I could do this, this, and this. And since he was already writing, able to talk to Carrie Bates about the Firestorm stuff, the Captain Atom stuff, we were able to make that all work. And Denny wanted nothing to do with it, so just let us do what we needed to do. And we went from there.
Interesting.
I can't think of a time where I said, I want this.
Just curious.
John and I went through Who's Who together to pick candidates for the Suicide Squad. So there definitely someone went, I want him. And John said, I want him and I want her. And, we just created a roster and we, said, all right, these are the people we want to work. So that was collaborative. That was not like insisting, I insist on Captain Boomerang. That just wasn't my nature.
Fair enough.
So Bob, I wanted to jump to Marvel for a bit. And
I was there for a while with you.
Yes. Full disclosure, we worked together. We were both there. The adjective I use for both of our times there, because you've written a blog series about your year at Marvel, so people can really dive into the details there. But I use the adjective tumultuous, and I think it wasn't probably just our experiences. I think that entire time period was fairly tumultuous in a good way and bad. I mean, there were a lot of new ideas that coming out of bankruptcy. The Ultimate line was coming out at that point. There was, the September 11th attacks and, Marvel's response to that. And just very strange machinations editorially that worked in some cases and didn't work in other cases.
Yeah.
But I guess, without getting too much into the sausage making, I was curious what were you brought in to do initially? Like, how was the role described to you and your goals? And then I guess we could do this as a follow-up. You don't have to tackle it in the same answer, but if you were given less restraints, what would you have liked to have accomplished?
Okay. At DC Comics, one of my roles was as the editorial coordinator. And I was master of the schedules for editorial and coordinated all the lettering and coloring assignments and rode over all of editorial in terms of on-time performance. I then left to go to an internet startup, and I was there 8-9 months, and I get a phone call from Joe Quesada. The guy who was doing the same job for Marvel, a guy named Andy Ball, had just put in his notice. He was going into the book publishing world. Joe said, Bob's the guy. Bob did it all at DC. Bob could do what Andy did. Let's bring him in. So Joe calls me in for an interview. I meet Bill Jemas for the first time. Now, remember, this is I had this interview late in 2000. And they're a year out of bankruptcy. They're still figuring out how to merge Toy Biz and Marvel operations and personnel, because there was some upper level management that Ike Perlmutter, the owner of the combined company, wanted to keep and tried to figure out, all right, how do I get a toy guy to work in publishing and that sort of thing? And Bill was in the process of reorganizing the company to what made sense to him, but recognized that he needed someone to make the trains run on time. And one of the things Bill and Joe said to me on that first meeting was, we need you to bring some of that DC discipline to Marvel editorial. because our books are running late. The editors don't seem to know which end is up. Come help us. They made me a beautiful offer. It was the most money I had ever been offered for a job. And it had a lovely title. And in the 3 or 4 weeks between the time I accepted the job and a set of responsibilities and the time I reported for work in January 2001, Bill had already decided to change how the organization was going to work. And I was suddenly reporting to a guy from the toy biz side of things who knew nothing about publishing and really was trying to figure out what his own role was going to be. And their pub ops guy who oversaw production had half a foot out the door at that point. Mike, did you know Frank Frechetta at the time?
Yes.
Okay. So Frank was,
remember the name.
Frank was there for a little while.
Yeah.
So I'm coming in and Frank's handing over some of the responsibilities. And at the time, Bill thought it would be okay if somebody else ran lettering and I ran coloring and working with production. There was all sorts of constant changes going on. But underneath it all, Bill had a vision. Bill was smart enough to recognize that digital was the future. He spent a lot of time with Johnny Roberts, who was one of the co-founders of Comixology, to build up the Marvel website, build up all these digital initiatives, and began to conceive that digital workflow. Scanned artwork, not the physical stuff, was the way of the future, and wanted the entire operation to start steering in that direction. So over the course of the year I was there, that was in development. So the other part of your question, I wish I was there to see it through and make it happen. I got as far as having them write custom software for all trafficking of the work, from the script delivery to the digital files going to the printer, that sort of thing. So we knew where everything was, and it was all in one master database, so anyone could tap in for their piece of the pie. So that was, one of my better accomplishments there. It was rolling out that November, December, just before I left. So I didn't have a chance to see it all the way through. And even when David Bogart was hired in that fall to be Bob Jr. to back me up, but was really brought in to replace me because Bill had lost faith in me in ways he never articulated. Between the two of us, we could not get the X Office on schedule for love or money. And some of the other editors, also struggling to get their books on time. Mike Martz and Tom Brevoort were dreams to work with, but some of the other guys, you had assistant editors becoming editors without enough training, I think, and they were floundering a little bit. And the idea of adhering to the schedules I was setting up for them felt constraining to them because they were used to the more freewheeling style, but the pressure was on to get the books out, especially as Bill was starting to do more and more trade paperbacks, which is where Mike stepped in. He came down from, you were in licensing, I think?
I was in licensing initially, yeah.
Yeah, and you came into collected editions to help because the volume of books was growing exponentially.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember this digitization project, which I do remember, at least Ben, and I'm not sure if I remember from your blogs, did you ever go to Yuma?
No, it was Ben Abernathy and Dan Carr, our production director, went to Yuma, where after Marvel moved offices and the film was sent to a warehouse in Yuma that Toy Biz owned. And apparently the stuff had been literally thrown onto the truck to get the truck out the door. That when it got to Yuma, everything was in such a mess that Ben and Dan had to go there and inventory all the stuff to make sure things made sense. So Spider-Man film was in the same place, that sort of stuff. And the whole idea was then to digitize the film. I was coming up with the schedules for all that digitization so that we had them available for trades.
Interesting. It sounds like things would have, hindsight is always 2020, but things would have been maybe more controllable had your role been split in some way. One, keeping the trains on time for current books, and two, someone to run the full digitization and collected editions part of it.
Maybe. As a director, I had a number of people reporting to me, but it was a really broad portfolio at the time because Bill kept, started an initiative and brought on some people to work on it and then gave it to me to, operate. And then he came up with the recharge card game and gave it to Ben and the collected editions people to put together because, hey, the reprints of art just in a card. And, he came up with one idea after another that taxed a lot of manpower. It needed a tad more discipline from the top.
Agreed.
So I wanted to ask you, you took a break from comics for a while. What brought you back to comics?
Well, I left DC to, very honestly, I was reaching a point in my career at DC where I wasn't sure I was going to grow in the way I wanted to grow because the department I was in at the time, editorial administration, had been fairly static. They seemed like there was going to be a lot of opportunities to grow as the company was evolving and changing. I was at entering my 40s, and I was thinking, is this really where I want to be for the rest of my adult career? I did not want to stay in that one role because it was going to get boring after a few more years. I wasn't sure what the options were. And then I got an opportunity to be a web producer for an internet startup that was run by an old college buddy of mine. And I said, this is the future, the internet, this is 1999, 2000. This was going to be the future. This was going to be really exciting. As you all have heard, you were probably youngsters at the time. There was an internet bubble burst in 2000, 2001. As it turns out, I joined Marvel about 6 weeks before I was going to be laid off because the cash was running out. So I went back to Marvel because I was a little bit frustrated in my role as a web producer. I really was having a hard time having the freedom to produce the packages I was hired to produce because other people felt I was stepping on their turf, and our CEO was very wishy-washy about where the line should be drawn. So I was frustrated. I was struggling to understand how to code in HTML, which was, like a foreign language to me. So when Joe called and said, come to Marvel and do this, and, by that point, I had heard of all this energy there. I had heard of, I'd seen the Ultimate line had launched really, really well. And I said, this could be really interesting. This could be a new, I had all this other stuff that they were giving me to do beyond just scheduling. So I said, all right, maybe I'll go to Marvel and see what happens. And that took a year.
Very nice.
I have a non-comic question for places you worked. As a big Universal Monsters fan, I saw you worked at Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. What was that experience like? Because that's like sort of the grail for a lot of us.
The Warren Publishing went out of business in the early 80s. And there were some issues regarding trademark and copyrights. And the trademark, the Famous Monsters, wound up in trademark court, where a guy named Phil Kim was able to buy the trademark from bankruptcy auction from what was left of Warren. Because, the rest of the properties were picked up by Harris Publishing, but not Famous Monsters. So that was sort of languishing. Phil, this is 2008. I am blanking right now on how Phil found me, but he called me out of the blue and started talking about how he wanted to revive it as a online magazine and then build up what Famous Monsters was, and wanted me to run the website, do the editorial content. And I had been at Fangoria as part of my Starlog Press experience. So, I grew up on the Universal movie monsters. I grew up on Famous Monsters and had met Furry Ackerman. Um, so I knew enough and liked it enough that I thought I could give it take what little internet experience I already had from just communications and my editorial experience from Starlog Press and apply it to a revived Famous Monsters Filmland website. And once all of this started getting announced, started being built up, Jim Warren reappears out of nowhere. He had been in Reading, Pennsylvania, and started to wait, you've got the trademark to my publication? What's going on here? So Jim and I had some very long, very bizarre phone calls, and then we had one meal. And then I put him in touch with Phil Kim, where they try and get Jim to say nice things to sort of give us his imprimatur so that people would, see it as a proper handoff. But he kept bristling when Phil Kim introduced me as, this is my Fari Ackerman, meaning me. And Warren is like, no, there's only one Fari. And I'm sitting there like, I'm not Fari, really. So we got the website up and running, and then Phil ran out of money to pay me. So he took it in-house with his girlfriend and other people. And he went back to print, and he's done all this other stuff. It was an interesting brief interlude.
Gotcha.
So Bob, I think we're coming soon to a close. But I wanted to touch quickly on your second stint at DC, and that was sort of flowing out of Marvel. You were in collected editions again, and
not again. Well, yes.
Well, from Marvel,
yeah.
And I'm interested in, that was basically, I guess it's been a growing niche, if it was even a niche back then, of the comic book industry. What did you like about your time on collected editions and that particular format, and what didn't you like?
At that point, 40 plus years of reading comic books, and put it to really good use as they were trying to find what haven't we collected, what's a new way to collect these storylines, what are some of the gems that we want to bring back to people. At the time, they were doing replica editions of some of the 80-page giants, and then they started creating these faux 80-page giant ideas. So, that was a tremendous amount of fun. They wanted to do their imitation of the Marvel black and white, phone book reprints.
Masterworks.
What?
Masterworks?
No, the Masterworks were the archive.
Oh, that's right. Essentials?
Yeah, thank you. The Essentials line.
Yeah.
They wanted to come up with their own edition version, which was the showcase line. So I helped get to design that pulp press because it was going to be black and white with lower price points and lower costs. Paul, as publisher, said, you can do the stuff that we don't think would sell in a $50 hardcover. So we could do Elongated Man and Martian Manhunter and Jonah Hex and all. So that was tremendous fun, helping pioneer that format. Then when DC got the ElfQuest license, I got to come up with digest little ElfQuest reprints we did, plus the archives. And because I had a previous friendship with the Peonies, they made an exception for me to edit new material of the ElfQuest, so briefly I had that much to do with the ElfQuest universe, which was tremendous fun as a fan of Richard and Wendy's work. So that was a lot of fun. The not fun part of it was the volume. We're talking hundreds of pages a month. And there were 4 of us at the time. And by adding the showcases, we were adding 500 pages a month minimum. We were doing 2 at a time. So if I did one, somebody else did one. That's still another 1,000 pages flowing through editorial, through proofreading, through production to make those pay stubs. It put a strain on the system. And I will admit there were some mistakes made, which is why after 4 years, I was relieved of my responsibilities.
Sounds like, I can't imagine that much volume going through such a small team, especially because you have to go through the entire process still, even though they are essentially reprints, correct?
Right, but DC's quality control insisted that our proofreader read them, that production clean up the artwork, make sure that they're, you know, pristine for reproduction, because they recognize by having these new black and white files, it would help international sales and would help future archives.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah. And, you know, it definitely, we were not necessarily fully staffed as well as we should have been. I have some quibbles with the way I was managed, but, you know, that's the past.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Bob, before we go, I wanted to ask, what do you have coming up comic book wise? Because I know you have your regular job, but you mentioned that you're still doing some consulting work with the DC.
For the last 5-6 years, Eagle Moss does these piecework collections of DC comics. You know, monthly you get the book and a figure and whatnot. I've been consulting on all the editorial content that is being generated by the UK, by Eagle Moss itself. And then looking at the foreign translations to make sure that all the credits are right, that, you know, the translations look fairly accurate based on Google Translate and all. And now Hachette is doing some international collections as well. So I'm looking at the Hachette material. You know, so that again, my expertise is of the past material has come in very handy there. And that actually led to, there's a French publisher going by the name of Urban Comics. They are doing a number of collections. They've got a Grant Morrison Man omnibus that they're going to be doing in Europe. And they asked me to write a piece summing up Grant's work there. But they're doing Batman by the year, basically, starting with the Denny O'Neil run in 1987. So it's 2 volumes. You get a volume of 1987 Batman, a volume of 1987 Detective. Yours truly has been hired to write the introductory material and interstitial text material for these collections.
Wow.
So they created the template. They did the first volume for 1987 to show how it should be done. So it's an introduction, setting the stage, putting 1987 Batman in context, and then every couple of issues being reprinted. There, you know, my job was to find a interesting point to stop and talk about. You know, so from the 1988 volumes, I had to talk about the 900 number, you know, Death in the Family story. I had to talk about Jim Starlin replacing Max Collins. You know, moments in each year's collection. So there's one long introduction and then like 7 other 1-page text pieces in each volume.
That sounds really
and that's Urban Comics. They're based in France. I don't know if any of it will be available in the US, but I'm having fun doing it.
That sounds great.
Beyond that, I'm doing comic related stuff in prose through Crazy 8 Press, the self-publishing imprint that I co-founded 11 years ago. Last year we did a book called The Phenomenons, which is a prose shared superhero universe. And we're in the midst right now, even as we speak, doing a campaign for the second volume. We hope to have the second volume fully funded in the next, I think we have 11 days to go. We're at the halfway mark now. It's called The Phenomenons. And Michael Jan Friedman, who wrote Star Trek for me, and you know, we collaborated on a lot of stuff, is the editor of that. It was his world, his concept, and me and scads of other people, you know, created characters who are now interacting with one another in that universe. So once we get fully funded, I'll be writing the second story for that.
And we're back. And that was a great interview. It was the first time we've had all 3 of us and a guest together in a while. So let's keep up the good work, guys. I love hearing about Bob's work. Specifically, he worked on Time Masters, which is a series of characters and stories that I absolutely adore. Always been a favorite of mine.
It's really cool to see somebody who's had so much success in the comic world and still loves comics. You know, it's not just a job for him. It's something that he still holds dear to his heart. And that really came through talking to him.
Yeah, Bob was a great sport. answered all our questions. We even went into some, parts of his career he probably would rather not relive. But I loved hearing from Bob. It was great to reconnect. And, that'll do it for this episode of Dollar Bin Bandits. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Peace.